All right. Welcome back to class. This lecture video, we will be talking about the color of law. So you should have read the text, The Color of Law, where it talks about owning your own home. So you should have read something about housing and housing segregation within the American context, specifically in the early to the middle part of the 20th century. So let's get started on that. First thing I want you to do is I want you to go to slide 2. And under slide 2, it talks about exclusionary zoning ordinances. Exclusionary zoning ordinances. So when we talk about housing segregation, and we're talking about how housing and access to housing has affected who gets to live in what space from a residential standpoint, and which racial groups are allowed to live in certain spaces, it's important for us to talk about how exclusionary zoning ordinances contributed to the makeup of cities, not only cities, but also suburbs. So the definition of exclusionary zoning ordinances is this: the legal practice that has been used for decades to keep lower income people, disproportionately racial minorities, out of wealthy and middle class neighborhoods across the country. Okay. And so essentially what we have is with exclusionary zoning ordinances, some zoning laws that have been used to discriminate against people of color and to ensure that property prices in suburban, and now when we think about gentrification more recently, urban neighborhoods stay at a specific price point, right? So just to kind of simplify it, exclusionary zoning ordinances are ways in which legally you can keep poor people, right? They try to make it more of a class thing as opposed to a race thing. But if you know anything about how race is inextricably linked to class, then you know that not necessarily that most people of color are poor, but that when you attack poor people, you're more than the people that are more likely going to be discriminated against. The racial group that will likely be more discriminated against are the people of color, specifically Black people in this instance. And so there were many different ordinances and there were many different ways and laws in which this was done to exclude certain groups, particularly lower income people, to hike up houses to a certain price so that it would keep these people who could not afford to move into these neighborhoods, to keep them out. Okay. So that houses would then stay at a certain price point and it can maintain wealth for a certain group of people. We'll talk about that in a second. And so some of the place restrictions on the types of homes that can be built in particular neighborhoods, when they came up with these zoning ordinances, there were certain rules and there were certain laws that were passed so that it would help regulate and keep certain groups, certain people who were more likely to live in a certain type of house, it would keep them out of those places. One of the things they had was minimum lot size requirements. Okay, minimum lot size requirements. So at minimum, your lot size had to be a certain size. If that's the case, then if you can afford a lot of a bigger size, it keeps that class group out of that house. It keeps that class group out of that neighborhood. Minimum square footage requirements. So your house had to be of a certain square foot, right? Again, if you could afford a 4,000 square foot house, a 3,000 square foot house, 3,500 square foot house, then cool. Okay. So I'm hoping that the last part was able to record and that you got it. If not, I'll just have to record it in the end, but I will just pick up where it left off. So then the exclusionary zoning ordinances, some of the restrictions that they had. Number one was minimum lot size requirements, minimum square footage requirements. So your home lot had to be a certain size. It had to be no smaller than a certain size. A minimum square footage requirement, it had to be a certain size as well. And so, of course, if you can't afford those homes, or you can't afford for your house to be that big or your lot to be that big, then you were then excluded from these homes. Prohibitions on multifamily homes. So oftentimes poor people, working class people, they oftentimes have multifamily homes. More than one family is often living in these homes. And then there were limits on the height of the buildings. So again, if you cannot afford to live in a building that is tall, live in a building that is big, then you were left out of many of these neighborhoods. You were not allowed to purchase a home in these particular neighborhoods. Oftentimes, these neighborhoods were neighborhoods where the housing prices were increasing. Okay. And so this made it extremely difficult to do things like build multifamily homes that would allow for lower incomes to live in wealthier neighborhoods. And alongside that, it did not allow them to have access to the quality schools, the employment that oftentimes was associated with these neighborhoods and associated with being able to afford to live in these homes. So in addition to the large lot size requirements, what would happen is if you have these large lots, then there was not a lot of available land. And with there being not a lot of available land, the housing prices would go up because the housing prices were associated with having large amounts of land. And so this also kept low income families out of certain neighborhoods. Okay. Now, this idea of exclusionary zoning ordinances that were put in place to keep out a certain class group was in response to a 1917 case where the Supreme Court stated that you could not ban people from living in a certain place based on race. Before you were allowed to do that, this was Jim Crow. Jim Crow started in arguably 1880s, but specifically around 1890s, 1896. Okay. But Jim Crow essentially made it so that you could have race-based discrimination legally. By the time we get to 1917, the United States is saying, well, you can't do that, right? That's not the type of country that we want to put forth, and people should be able to live wherever they can afford to live, regardless of their race. So what city planners started to do was they say, well, listen, we can't allow for people of color. We can't allow for Black people. We can't allow for poor people or certain people to be able to live in these areas because it's going to stop wealthy white people from moving into these neighborhoods. And this is going to drive the property value down. And it's about the dollar. So we need to keep these neighborhoods white if we want to continue to make money. And we need to keep them rich so that we can continue to make money. So city planners started to segregate using these more indirect methods. And this is proven, right? This is what the color of law is arguing in this text. This is proven because in St. Louis, there were zoning laws that were designed to preserve homes in areas that were unaffordable to a majority of Black families. And the city zoning commission would change an area's zoning designation from residential, a residential zoning designation to industrial if too many Black families moved in, right? So that way it would not receive the benefits of being a residential designation if there were too many Black families. If there were too many Black families that could afford it, then they would not necessarily get the benefits of living in that area because it would now be called an industrial area as opposed to a residential area, right? What those benefits are, you would have to look further into that. But you would, if you were considered to live in a residential zoning area, there were oftentimes benefits to that. Seattle also had zoning laws in 1923 where the areas where Black people or Chinese people lived were disproportionately likely to receive commercial zoning. So very much like the industrial zoning in St. Louis, in Seattle, it was the same thing, right? So these were actual laws that were put in place where they would look and say, okay, well, there's a predominantly Asian population here. There's a predominantly Black population here. If we change what kind of residential or what kind of area this is, then that is another way in which we keep dollars and we keep profits from going into those neighborhoods and keep them in predominantly white neighborhoods. Also, there was restrictions in housing. So if we go to the next slide, there were restrictions in housing. And what these restrictions in housing ended up doing to the larger society. One of the things it did was it limited labor mobility. It limited labor mobility. So workers could not afford to move to higher productivity cities that have high housing prices, right? So if you want to move to New York, if you want to move to a Chicago, workers couldn't afford to move to a place that had higher productivity, where they could get jobs, where they could make more money, where they could work more hours because they could not afford the housing. So maybe they had the knowledge and the intelligence to do the job, but they couldn't afford the housing, so they couldn't move there. They couldn't move to that city. They were stuck, right, in the South or in the Midwest or in some rural area, right? This led workers to remain in lower productivity places. So now they're stuck at a job. They're stuck doing a position that they're overqualified for, but because they can't afford to live in a house in the city where they can work, now they're stuck where they are, right? And so this is one of the restrictions in housing. This was one of the effects of that. Another effect of the restrictions in housing is the racial wealth gap. So essentially, even if you are an African American that is educated, that has a good job, that makes good money, and you can afford to live in a neighborhood that is predominantly white, you have the credit score, you have the income, and you can afford it. But because of these zoning laws, and we're going to talk about some other ways in which certain people were left out, even middle-class people that I'm talking about now, Black middle-class people were left out, they had to live in predominantly Black areas. Sometimes there were even realtors and real estate agents who refused to show them homes in predominantly white areas, would only show them homes in predominantly Black areas because they will get kickbacks if they made sure that certain areas were kept white. If these areas are white, if you do not allow people of color to move into these areas, you can get a kickback. It was part of your job to keep certain areas white. And so oftentimes, Black middle class, Black professionals had to live in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And it wasn't that they didn't want to because they were Black. Many of them enjoyed living in neighborhoods where there were people that looked like them, shared their culture, shared their ideas, etc. But they also knew when it's time to sell this home, it's not going to be worth as much as if I lived in that white neighborhood. They knew that. And so many of them wanted to live in the white neighborhood, even though they may not have felt as comfortable, even though they knew that the people didn't want them there. But I know that my house is going to be worth something when I'm ready to sell it. They did it for wealth purposes. But the restrictions in housing made them have to get houses in Black neighborhoods or poor neighborhoods, and therefore it lessened the value of the home. And as we know, a majority of people, not just Black people, but Black people, white people, people in general, much of our wealth is tied up into the homes that we own. Housing, real estate, that is where oftentimes our wealth is tied up. So Black families are excluded from higher priced neighborhoods, or Black families live in zones to be less valuable, which means your homes purchased by Black families will not be worth as much over time as those of white families, right? And with the opposite sometimes happening with gentrification is sometimes white families will purchase a home that was previously owned by a Black person that was in a Black neighborhood, wait till that neighborhood turns around and becomes a white neighborhood, and then goes back and sells that home. Now you may have purchased that home for $90,000, $100,000, and now you go around and you sell that home for $450,000 because you were a white person who now lives around white people, and now you've made incredible profit off of that home. So that's how the racial wealth gap happens when there's restrictions in housing, right? Also, the restrictions in housing prevent low-income families from having access to the education and employment opportunities that they see in wealthier neighborhoods. Because in wealthier neighborhoods, you have more people that have greater networks. The person next to you may be a lawyer. The person next to you may be a doctor. The person next to you may be a businessman. The person across the street may be a whatever, politician. Their networks, the opportunities that exist in wealthier neighborhoods. The schools are oftentimes given money and funding based on the property value of the homes. If the property value of the homes are high, the funding is high for the schools, and therefore they say you have a much better educational opportunity. Just because it's more expensive doesn't mean that it's better. But there are a lot of opportunities that exist in wealthier neighborhoods when it comes to education. There is a certain type of education that can exist. Doesn't mean it's always better, but it can be better. Okay. Also, a major part of this chapter was the Own Your Own Home program. Now, the Own Your Own Home program was put in place in the early part of the 20th century, largely because a large part of the 20th century was about the battle of communism, right? Democracy, the fight for democracy, the battle between capitalism and communism, right? The battle between capitalism, democracy and socialism, right? And so one of the things, what was happening at one point was that there was a Russian Revolution that occurred in the early part of the 20th century. And when the Russian Revolution happened and Russia became a much more powerful country, they started to spread communism around the world. And now communism is becoming more and more popular at the turn of the 20th century. And so because of that, one of the things that America wanted to do, was to say, well, one of the ways in which we can defeat communism is if we help to spread the wealth of our country. If we show that in a capitalist society, in the society in which we are building, we create wealth for our people. And one of the ways we do that is we help to ensure that they own homes. If you are an American and you're an American citizen and you do well and you work hard, you can own your own home. Let me show you. And then they begin to pass this Own Your Own Home program, where homeowners are more likely to participate in the capitalist system. So they were trying to win over all these other countries by saying, in a capitalist society, look at all of these people that own their own homes, as opposed to this communist society where they don't. And so all of these programs started popping up all over the nation about owning your own home. And what this Own Your Own Home program did was it encouraged home buyers to don't rent, but own property. But this Own Your Own Home program was racialized because they would also encourage home buyers to, when you own your own home, make sure you buy a home in a racially segregated area. Why? Because we don't want the racial strife. We already know that we have an issue of race in our society. We already know that we have an issue of black and white division. We don't want to add to that with this program. So if you're white, buy a home in a white area. If you're black, buy a home in a black area. If you're Latinx, buy a home in a black area or Latinx area. But do not use these programs to try to mix homes, to try to integrate society. And so these programs encourage home buyers that segregation would help to avoid a lot of the drama and a lot of the issues between the racial groups. Okay. And this was even to the point where you probably heard of FHA or FHA loan. That is typically the loan that a person gets when they want to purchase a home. FHA, and this is Federal Housing Authority. The Federal Housing Authority, which is the leading authority on home buying in America, actually put as one of their requirements, in order for you to get a loan, if you're a white person, in order for you to get a loan, you had to live in a whites only area. The loan required a whites only requirement. Sometimes they would even finance a whole neighborhood, largely white only neighborhoods. Okay, to help ensure that there was racial segregation. If a person of color, a Black person wanted to buy a home in a white neighborhood, they could afford it. They had the income, they had the credit score, they had everything. But they needed a loan. FHA would deny the loan if they were trying to integrate a whites only neighborhood. Okay? So these are the ways in which laws and regulations were put in place systematically. Not just certain people saying, I don't want to live with the Blacks. I don't want to live with the Asians. I don't want it wasn't that. Systematically, there were structures that were put in place to say, no, we want to make sure that there is separation for the almighty dollar. We want to make sure there's a separation of the races. So let's look at page 65, the very first paragraph. You can pause it and go there. Page 65, the very first full paragraph. It says, when a bank applied to the FHA for insurance on a prospective loan, the agency conducted a property appraisal, which was also likely performed by a local real estate agent hired by the agency. As the volume of applications increased, the agency hired its own appraisers, usually from the ranks of the private real estate agents who had previously been working as contractors for the FHA. To guide their work, the FHA provided them with an underwriting manual. The first, issued in 1935, gave this instruction. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social race and classes, by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in values. Appraisers were told to give higher ratings where protection against some adverse influences is obtained, and that important among adverse influences are infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. The manual concluded that all mortgages on properties protected against such unfavorable influences, to the extent such protection is possible, will obtain a higher rating. So essentially, you were given a higher rating on your house, a higher appraisal on your house, if it was in a predominantly white area, if it was in an area where everybody was of the same social, of the same racial and social class. Okay. So right here, we're seeing this is not things that are being made up, but this is a reality. These are actual laws, and this is actually coming from the underwriting manual. If you know anything about getting a home, it has to go through underwriting before it gets approved. Okay. Suburbanization. So another way in which owning a home had these racial implications and class implications was many people who lived in the city, when they were ready to own a home and when they would push these own your own home programs, they were moving from the city to the suburbs, essentially white flight. White people were moving out of the city. They wanted their own homes. They wanted their own yards. And so they were moving to the suburbs, and the suburbs became synonymous with white. And the city became synonymous with people of color, poor, and Black. That's why you hear the term inner city. And typically, if you hear the term inner city, people are saying it's crime ridden, it's black, it's poor, it's ghetto, right? And so this suburbanization helped to to add on to, right? Help to add on to, help to magnify the racial segregation that was already existing in the residential space. Okay. Also the veteran, so not just the FHA loan, but the Veteran Affairs loan, the VA loan. VA loans were used for servicemen, people who went off to war. They would come back. They didn't even have to get an FHA loan. They can get a VA loan. And the country was going to make sure that there was enough money for them to be able to get a loan to own a home, as long as you served in the military. And so they had their own laws. They had their own laws, they had their own underwriting, they had their own regulations. Well, guess what they did? They adopted FHA guidelines. So if the FHA, which we already saw, promoted racial segregation, the VA did the same thing. You're not going to get this loan unless you're in a all white, all black, all whatever neighborhood. So the same guidelines that the FHA had, those were the guidelines that the VA had. So there was no getting around it. And those were your major options. You don't want other options. And now there's a couple other options. But at the time, FHA for regular people, VA for your service people. Now, sometimes they would say that in order to calm the civil rights protests, sometimes the VA would give a few loans to Black applicants, because this was also in the 1950s and 1960s, where more and more people of color and Black people leading this charge are saying, this is unfair. We want fair housing rights, and push for a Fair Housing Act that eventually got passed in, I believe, 1967. So in order to quelch the pushback from Black folks, to quelch the pushback from people of color, they said, okay, we'll give a few Black people some loans. Because if we continue to do this, they're going to continue to raise all of this hell, and it's going to make us look bad in front of the rest of the world, because they're showing it on the news. And this news is being seen all over. From Brazil to Singapore to Great Britain and Germany and Russia. And Russia's using this to say, hey, are you sure you want to adopt a so-called democracy where all of their people don't even have access to housing? Doesn't look very democratic to me. And it's making them look bad. So the VA is saying, listen, we'll give a few loans to a few Black people so that it'll help us look better. Right? So this is the Own Your Own Home program. Again, Color of Law is showing how the laws that were put in place during these times were used to keep people separated based on color, and to perpetuate certain class divisions based on color and based on social class. If you look at this map, this is called the Hope Map. This is a Hope Map, I believe, of Atlanta, Georgia. And what this map did is it was created to assess the value, risk, and potentiality of neighborhoods. Okay. So the safe neighborhoods were always in green. The riskiest neighborhoods were in red, and all Black, even if it was middle class. So even if it was a middle class neighborhood where it was nothing but Black professionals, if it was all Black, it was considered red. And these maps, these Hope Maps, were created in major cities all over the United States to show lenders, not lenders, to show realtors, these are the maps, this is where people are living, and this is where you want to send people. If they're Black, I don't care if they're middle class, working class, poor, whatever, send them to the red. If it is green, if it's a white person, send them to the green. These maps were created to help keep people within their own racial group and within their own class group, as outlined by the FHA guidelines as well as the VA guidelines. Now, the assignment that I want you to do, live local act discussion. What you're going to do is you're going to click on this link. You're going to read this article on the Live Local Act. It's a Senate Bill 102 that I think is specific to Florida. And I want you to summarize the LLA. And I want you to tell me, what are some of the pros and cons of this bill? Okay. What are some of the pros and cons of this bill? And then I want you to explain to me why you think this bill may be good and or bad when it comes to addressing issues related to affordable housing. And I want you to use info from the lecture and the reading to help support why you believe this is the case. Okay. And you have to use stuff that I just talked about. So again, if you're just putting this in Chat GPT or putting this somewhere and then copying and pasting it, it's not going to get you what you need. You have to actually look for things that I have talked about, because that's what I'm looking for. And the people that are getting hundreds, people that are getting 90s, I mean, even if they might be using some other source, they're at the very least, I am seeing where you can see where they're thinking through and they're utilizing material that is in the book, utilizing material that is in the reading, utilizing material that comes from the PowerPoints, so that I know that you are paying attention. And sometimes I can tell when you are and when you're not. Maybe there may be some people that are getting away, but there's some that are not. So again, make sure that you are using the information so that I know that you are actually reading something and paying attention to the videos and paying attention to your notes. Is the Live Local Act a continuation of ordinance we discussed in the lecture? If so, how? If not, how is it different? And I want you to use significant information from the lecture and reading to answer that question. Follow this discussion board, follow the discussion board directions on the syllabus, and this is going to be due what you see on the presentation. What you see on the PowerPoint is when it is due. Right? All right. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. Please reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to answer them. I hope that this Color of Law book, and I hope that this reading and this lecture has helped you understand all that information a little bit better. And that is it for this section.